All right, so we are going to spend today talking about issues 10 and 11, kind of finishing up our study of Hawkeye. I really wish that you guys could read the entire series, all 22 issues, but I don't have enough copies of Volume 2. Now, if you really liked these first 11 issues and you want to get the others, I do have access to them. And if you're a really fast reader, you can borrow them from me if you'd like to. Just remind me when I get back into the classroom. So in issue 10, we are really introduced to our third Hawkeye. In all, there are 4 different Hawkeyes. If you include the dog, then there's 5 Hawkeyes. In this series, there's Hawkeye Clint Barton, there's Hawkeye Kate Bishop, and there's Hawkeye Barney Barton, who hasn't shown up truly yet. He does actually appear at one point during the 11th issue, and we'll talk about him. But Barney is another Hawkeye. He's another person that went by the name Hawkeye at one point. And then there's Kazi, who is never called a Hawkeye, but he is such a foil for Clint. He is so clearly designed to be Clint's opposite and equal. He is cold and calculated, where Clint is kind of passionate and kind of a train wreck and a mess, but they are still very similar characters. And this cover shows you what I mean by him as a Hawkeye. He is a bird of prey. He is a predator that has a piercing gaze. And so this idea of him as Hawkeye is metaphoric. And throughout this series, when these two characters eventually do meet, it's really, to me, the highlight of the series. Kazi is clearly the main villain of this story, even though he doesn't show up until very late in the story. Both are blonde men of about the same age. Both of them are long-range weapons. Where Clint uses the bow and arrow, Kazi uses guns. Both of them grew up involving the circus. Clint and Barney, his brother, lived on the circus after the death of their parents. Kazi and his brother came from a circus. Their family ran the circus. And I think a lot of it is looking at the alterations of these characters, where Kazi started at a circus and was removed from it, placing him into kind of a child soldier position. Barney and Clint, after being in this horrible relationship with their family, was sent to the circus, where they spent the rest of their childhood there, and the circus became kind of a family that they had, where Kazi is removed from his family. His family's literally burnt down. And so a lot of the things we can look at is we can look at this issue, an issue you guys haven't read, which is issue 12, and we can look at the way they combine these two. Frank Flancelli, I believe that's how you pronounce his name, the Italian artist that did this issue, is such a great decision to use him. And he comes back only for one other issue, which is issue 12. So here we have this moment that seems to be a suggestion, at least, of Kazi's first professional assassination, and showing his life in this shattered image, metaphor. And in his next issue, where Frank Chavilla, is that how you pronounce it? At any rate, in issue 12, which actually is the Barney issue, that kind of talks about Barney and Clint through Barney's point of view, has this moment where they show the death of their parents in a very similar fashion of this kind of broken glass. I talked earlier about how Clint's life is a car accident, and in this book, it's literally going back to this moment, that the death of his parents in a car accident is kind of the metaphor about him. And so the other thing about Kazi that's different from Clint is the lack of the brother. So Kazi's brother is killed, and so he becomes an isolated loner, where with Hawkeye, even though eventually his relationship with Barney deteriorates, which is why Barney hasn't been in the story up to this point, because Barney actually becomes a villain, It's his brother that gets him through the things. Everything that Kazi doesn't have, Clint does have. And so family relationships, some sort of strong bond with somebody else who cares about him, is what Kazi's missing. He's also just an interesting character in that everything that he seems to be good at, Clint is not good at. So here we have him as this smooth talker who's effective with the ladies, where we're also watching Clint kind of self-explode when it comes to his relationship with women. With Kazi, you have this guy who is smooth with women, and this scene with him and Kate is such a great scene. First off, I love the irony, the dramatic irony of a character talking to the villain. This also takes place in the past. This is before Kate comes home back to the apartment. This is before Kazi kills Grills. And yet she doesn't know that she's eventually going to fight this guy. She doesn't even know that this is the killer. And I love the dramatic irony of this line. This one right over here. You can't just be Joe Cool Guy, exit like that. You're not the hero of this story. I am. That's such a great dramatic irony line, that he is not the hero of this story, even though he is the protagonist in the sense that this issue is about him, but he is clearly the villain of this story, and I love that little line. It's also during this issue that we finally get the fight right before Grills is killed. That this is the moment where somebody is yelling at him about his messed up life. And so when he's talking to Grills about the woman that he doesn't know what to say to, write that letter, it's confirmed that it is in fact Kate. Then we go on to issue 11. Issue 11 is an award-winning issue. It won multiple Eisners, and the Eisner is basically the comic book version of the Tony Awards or the Emmys or the Oscars. There's two big awards in comics. The Eisner is the biggest award, and the Harvey Award is the second biggest award. And this particular issue won, I think it was 6 different Eisners, from best single issue, best writing, best lettering, best artist. I mean, it just won a whole bunch of stuff. And it's a wonderful issue that is doing a lot of different things, but one of the best things it's doing is creating a detective fiction out of a dog. And so throughout this issue, I love the way it uses the dog's point of view, even down to the dog seeing kind of black and white. So we see the world from the dog's point of view where he sees these. And I love the words the dog can understand and the words the dog can't understand. So it understands don't, it understands help, it understands Kate because it hears those words repeatedly. And so it tells you about what environment is he in. And I love the way it also shows how he thinks in terms of smell. It smells like his Clint, and he kind of recognizes him symbolically. It's such a wonderful book when it comes to that things. And we get a lot of these moments where we see stories just from these few little tiny lines. Like, he knows collar, he knows stay, because those are words that he interacts with. That somebody might say, let me put on your collar, you need to stay, boy. And so those words are ones that the dog understands. And one thing I think is really cool about this issue is most of these scenes that you're seeing, like this one and this one, anytime when you're only getting a point of view of the dog, in later issues, you will see the same scene again in which you get to see it from the human point of view, and so you get all the information. So even though in this scene, I did not fully understand what this was talking about, what was going on, nor do we really know who is talking. Is this Clint speaking, or is this Kate speaking? And what are they talking about? And you won't find this out until later when you see the scene again from a different character's point of view. So we're going to look at this one as detective fiction and kind of define what kind of detective fiction this is, because there are certain patterns of detective fiction, and there's two types. There's traditional detective fiction, and then there's hard-boiled detective. And so with both, you have basically the introduction of the detective, the presentation of the crime, the investigation, the solution, the apprehension of the criminal. That's in kind of all detective fiction. And so the biggest difference is that with the classic detective fiction, this is like Sherlock Holmes' tale, the focus is on the plot. Hard-boiled detectives, the focus is on the characters. So Sherlock Holmes, oftentimes he's so brilliant that you don't get a sense of him as a real person. It's just his intelligence, especially in the Conan Doyle version. As you look at more modern versions of Sherlock Holmes, the more and more he becomes hard-boiled detective, where it becomes about his crazy character and pursuing that. And so with detective fiction, regardless of which version you're at, there is somebody who introduces you to a crime. So our detective, Arrow, or Lucky, or Pizza Dog, however you want to call him, is hanging out. Young lady comes up to him saying that there's trouble. And so he has to follow the young lady up to the murder of Grills. And I love this line, "Pizza is my business." What a great detective fiction title. And so he then goes through the process of investigating the scene. And it's such a clever way to show an investigation of the scene, to show kind of what happened, how does he pursue the world, and you can kind of look at, I love these little diagrams where 1 is Grills and 2 is where Clint was, and then 3 is our mystery man. And I love the suggestion of lips as in makeup. And I'm pretty sure if we go back to, yep, here we go, makeup here as well. The smell of makeup is what he can smell on women. And so he's a little confused, as it seems both a combination of gun and makeup and yet a masculine scent. And so we get this sense of them. And then we see him definitely as this hard-boiled detective eating cold pizza. Part of the hard-boiled detective world is the urban nature, the kind of lower-class nature of the detective. Where if you look at classic detective fiction, it's this kind of nearly upper-class view of life, a very scientific view. That if you look at Sherlock Holmes versus Sam Spade, Sherlock Holmes would never eat cold pizza, certainly not cold pizza thrown out, but our detective here is a much rougher character. And then we have this moment when he protects somebody, and so you have him coming in as a protector and as an aggressor, and that's something also in detective fiction. Then in detective fiction, there's violence. In Sherlock Holmes' classic detective, it doesn't mean so much that there's going to be a scene of violence, but in hard-boiled detectives, it often leads to violence. And in this moment, we have this great introduction of this character, a character who is here and is kind of like this. And that is because this is our introduction to Barney, Clint's brother. So here's Barney Barton, this down on his luck individual, getting beaten up by these two guys who are his former owners. And so, of course, he goes totally crazy on them. And then I love these moments right here, especially this moment where we see Arrow or Lucky or Pizza Dog becoming just like Hawkeye. And this is where I was like, maybe you can call this the fifth Hawkeye. And I just love this image. I think it's very clever. Then, of course, we have the reintroduction of the woman. And often in detective fiction, especially hard-boiled detective fiction, there's a couple of different tropes that show up. One is the detective getting the girl, and then the other is the betrayal of that girl, that she becomes the dark female character. And in here we find out that this female dog is actually working for the bad guys. And that's part of it, is that in the classic version of a detective, basically you have a bunch of possible criminals, and then you get rid of them, you sort of isolate until you come up with one. And so, generally speaking, corruption in the Sherlock Holmes tale is an isolated, singular evil villain. But with hard-boiled detection, it's generally a series of emotional shifts and betrayal where victims become villains, where friends become enemies, and by the end of the story, it feels not like one isolated villain, but the world is corrupt, that everything is corrupt, and that the hard-boiled detective is often surrounded by evil. And so that's what happens here, where he finds out that the girl is actually a villain, and she's surrounded by these evil bad guys, and so then he has to fight the bad guys, and he gets defeated. And I love the fact that because it is a dog, they simply sit around and, he's cowering in the background until he gets a chance to escape. But it's just a wonderful issue. There's a reason why it did so well. And then we have this moment right here where Kate and Clint separate. And it's the beginning of a real shift in this book where the Kate story will continue on without her going off to California, and the Clint story continues in New York, and it actually goes back and forth. Every issue is a Kate or a Clint issue. And this one scene is shown over and over and over again. It's at least 3 times I can think of. There's this version from the dog's point of view, much like this version of the dog's point of view versus this version, which is Clint's point of view in a later issue. This version versus this version, where we get all the information again. And then so we have this version. We have this version from the Hawkeye Annual, which is the beginning of the Kate story, in this very strangely silhouetted version of this, where we see it from the human point of view of Kate and Clint. And then we actually see this one more time in Barney's point of view, as you find out that Clint's brother Barney is actually here. He's just in the restroom listening to this happen and overhearing it. And so the 3 different ways that this issue is looked at. So I hope you enjoyed this series. I love it. It's maybe not for everyone, but I really loved it. So I will see you when I get back. But what I want you guys to do, your kind of next assignment, I believe I mentioned this earlier, but I will mention it now definitely, is that I want you to work on a comic that is your own version of a Hawkeye comic. So it doesn't have to be Hawkeye, it doesn't have to be Clint Barton, but instead what I want you to do is take a superhero, any superhero you can think of, and try to create what is his day like when he's not a superhero. And so the everyday, ordinary, normal life of any superhero, and how can you play on those tropes of trying to see how does he feel about his own normal life, where's his sense of obligation, or how does he protect his secret identity, whatever you want to think of it as. And so I want you to work on that. If you can't get that, or if you don't feel like you can get that, then I want you to see if you can do comics in this style of art, this kind of like diagramming style. It's very much an indie comics way of doing things. So those are your 2 options. Create a comic in which you take a superhero and put him in the average everyday life, or do a comic that's looking at the world perhaps from a different point of view, or using these diagrams to show the world in this complex web of storytelling where all these different things are kind of moving everywhere. Pick one of those 2 and create a comic of whatever length that you feel you have time to. So for people that are seniors, perhaps you only have 1 week left in school, so maybe you only do a 1 or 2 page comic. For other people, you might want to do a little bit longer. So that is the assignment. Get to it. Hopefully you've had enough time of working on these comics that you've been working on from the very beginning that you can fit this in. I hope you can. All right. Thank you, gentlemen. Bye.